When he walked into the courtroom, Judge Coleman's heart stopped. She knew that face. 20 years had passed, but she could never forget El Lobo, one of the most dangerous men from the Mexican cartel. Now he was here, in her small town, with a fake identity, acting innocent. But Judge Coleman knew who he was, because former DEA agent Patricia Coleman had hunted him for years. Welcome to Echo Stories. Before we begin this powerful story, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Millbrook County Courthouse, rural Texas, population 8,500. A place where the biggest crimes were usually DUI cases or domestic disputes. Judge Patricia Coleman had presided over this courtroom for 15 years, handling small-town justice with patience and fairness. At 62, Judge Coleman was respected by everyone in town. Former prosecutor, law degree from UT, always professional. She'd moved to Millbrook after a career change, though nobody knew the details. She said she wanted a quieter life, and the town was happy to have such an experienced judge. The courthouse was old but well-maintained. Wood paneling, American flag, the usual formal atmosphere. Judge Coleman's routine was predictable. Traffic violations at 9 a.m., civil disputes at 11 a.m., criminal cases after lunch. But this Tuesday morning would shatter that quiet routine forever. Case number 2024-CR-0847, State of Texas versus Miguel Rodriguez, the clerk announced. Identity theft and fraud charges. Judge Coleman looked down at her paperwork. Standard case. Someone using false documents, probably for employment. She'd handled hundreds of these over the years. "Defendant, please step forward," she called out, not looking up from the file. When she raised her eyes, the world stopped. Standing before her was a man in his 50s, well-dressed in a cheap suit, looking nervous like any other defendant. But Judge Coleman knew that face. The scar above the left eyebrow, the distinctive jawline, the cold, calculating eyes that she'd stared at across interrogation tables 20 years ago. Miguel El Lobo Sandoval, one of the most wanted cartel leaders she'd pursued during her DEA years. Judge Coleman's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her gavel. She forced herself to remain calm, professional. But her mind was racing. This couldn't be the same man. El Lobo had been presumed dead after a DEA raid in 2004. His body was never found, but the compound had been destroyed. How could he be here, in rural Texas, facing identity theft charges? "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, testing the name. "You're charged with using false documents to obtain employment. How do you plead?" The man looked up, and for a split second, their eyes met. Judge Coleman saw something flicker. Recognition, uncertainty. Then he spoke. "Not guilty, Your Honor." That voice, that slight accent. It was him, no question, but he was using a different name, different identity. If she was right, if this really was El Lobo, then he was one of the most dangerous men who had ever stood in her courtroom. Judge Coleman called for a brief recess. In her chambers, she sat alone, hands shaking. 20 years of memories flooded back. DEA agent Patricia Coleman, 1998 to 2005. 7 years undercover in Mexico and Texas border towns. She'd spent 3 years specifically hunting El Lobo's organization, drug trafficking, money laundering, murder. He was responsible for dozens of deaths, millions in narcotics distribution. The case that ended her career, 2004, a raid on El Lobo's compound. 3 agents died that night. Patricia barely escaped alive. The intelligence had been compromised. Someone on the inside had warned the cartel. She'd left the DEA after that. Too dangerous, too personal. She'd gone to law school, started over, became the person she was today. But now, sitting in her small-town courthouse, the past had literally walked through her door. Judge Coleman returned to the bench. She had options. Recuse herself, claim conflict of interest, continue the case, act like she didn't recognize him, contact federal authorities immediately. But each option carried risks. If she recused herself, he might disappear again. If she continued, she could be compromised. If she called the feds, she'd blow her own cover, and the town would learn about her past. "Defense counsel," she addressed the public defender. Does your client have any other pending cases? No, Your Honor. Mr. Rodriguez is employed at the local meatpacking plant. He's been a model citizen for 2 years. 2 years. He'd been hiding in plain sight for 2 years. Prosecution. What's the evidence against Mr. Rodriguez? Your Honor, defendant was using false social security numbers and identity documents. Standard case, really. Judge Coleman studied the file. Miguel Rodriguez, the identity was well constructed, but underneath, she knew, was one of the most wanted fugitives in DEA history. Judge Coleman made her choice. She would handle this carefully, legally, but she wouldn't let him escape again. Mr. Rodriguez, given the nature of these charges, I'm ordering a pre-trial investigation into your background and employment history. Bailiff, please escort the defendant to holding. Your Honor, the defense attorney protested, this is a minor charge. My client has been released on his own recognizance. Not anymore. I want a complete background check before we proceed. As the bailiff approached, El Lobo's demeanor changed slightly. The nervous defendant mask slipped, replaced by something colder, more calculating. Judge Coleman, he said, voice steady now, I think you might be making a mistake. The way he said her name sent chills down her spine. He knew. He'd recognized her too. During lunch break, Judge Coleman returned to her chambers to find El Lobo sitting in her chair. Hello, Patricia. Her blood ran cold. No one in town knew her first name was Patricia. She went by Judge Coleman, or Pat to close friends. How did you get in here? Small-town security, he smiled. Not like the federal buildings you used to work in. Judge Coleman reached for her phone, but El Lobo shook his head. I wouldn't. We need to talk. About what? About why we're both here. About why Agent Patricia Coleman became Judge Coleman. About why Miguel Sandoval became Miguel Rodriguez. He knew everything. You disappeared after the raid, Judge Coleman said, trying to maintain control. You nearly killed me, El Lobo replied. 3 bullets, 2 operations, 6 months in hiding. But I survived. 3 agents died that night. Yes, because someone warned us you were coming. Judge Coleman's heart sank. She'd always suspected a leak but could never prove it. Who? Someone you trusted. Someone close to the operation. El Lobo reached into his jacket slowly, pulled out a thick folder. I've spent 20 years gathering evidence about the corruption in your unit, about who really betrayed those agents. He slid the folder across the desk. Agent Sarah Mitchell, your partner, your best friend. Judge Coleman opened the folder with trembling hands. Bank records, phone transcripts, surveillance photos, all showing Agent Sarah Mitchell taking payments from the cartel, providing intelligence, warning them about raids. Sarah died in that raid, Judge Coleman whispered. She died because she tried to double-cross us. We found out she was feeding information to both sides. The room spun. Sarah Mitchell had been her closest friend, her mentor. They'd worked together for 3 years. Patricia had mourned her death, blamed herself for not protecting her. Why are you telling me this? Because I want those who killed my family to pay. Your corrupt agents didn't just betray you. They betrayed me too. I lost everything that night. El Lobo's voice was steady, but she could hear the pain underneath. My wife, my children. They were in the compound when your people came. Sarah Mitchell told them it would be empty. Judge Coleman stared at the evidence. Everything she'd believed about that night was wrong. What do you want? Justice. The same thing you became a judge to pursue. I can't just... You're a criminal. You've killed people. So have your corrupt agents. The difference is, my crimes are documented. Theirs are buried. El Lobo leaned forward. There are others still alive, still in the DEA, still covering up what happened. Help me expose them, and I'll surrender myself to federal custody. Why should I trust you? Because, Patricia, we both know what it's like to lose everything to corruption. Judge Coleman spent that night reading through the evidence. Bank accounts linking DEA agents to cartel money. Radio transcripts showing coordination between law enforcement and criminals. Photos of meetings between federal agents and known cartel members. It was all there. 20 years of corruption, covered up, buried. The next morning, she made her decision. Mr. Rodriguez, she said in open court, Based on new evidence that has come to light, I'm dismissing all charges against you." The prosecutor looked shocked. "Your Honor. Furthermore, I'm recommending this case be forwarded to federal authorities for investigation of potential misconduct in the original identification process." El Lobo met her eyes and nodded slightly. 3 weeks later, FBI agents arrested 5 current and former DEA officials. The evidence Judge Coleman provided led to the largest corruption investigation in DEA history. Miguel Sandoval surrendered himself to federal custody, cooperating fully with authorities. In exchange for his testimony, he received a reduced sentence and placement in witness protection. Judge Coleman's past was revealed during the investigation. The town learned their quiet judge was a former DEA agent, but instead of being upset, they were proud. "She brought justice to our courthouse," the mayor said, even when it was difficult. 6 months later, Judge Coleman still presided over the same courtroom, but now she had FBI protection and a deeper understanding of justice. El Lobo had been right about one thing. They both knew what it was like to lose everything to corruption. But they'd also learned that sometimes justice requires former enemies to work together. The DEA corruption case was still ongoing. More arrests were expected, and in a small courthouse in rural Texas, justice had been served by the most unlikely alliance in law enforcement history. Sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. A small-town judge and a cartel leader united by their desire to expose the truth about corruption that had destroyed both their lives. Real justice isn't about law versus crime. It's about truth versus corruption. And sometimes the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones standing trial. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe stories like this should continue to be told, support Echo Stories by subscribing. See you in the next video. And remember, justice sometimes wears a black robe and sometimes doesn't, but it always seeks the truth.